As we remember the heroic campaigners of the past, who fought to include the voices of all citizens in our public debate, we should consider the values and principles that guide our conduct today and how we can maintain a healthy public debate for the future.
On the 6th of February 2018, then UK Prime Minister Theresa May gave a speech about standards in public life to mark the centenary of the Representation of the People Act, which is perhaps most remembered for extending voting rights to people like her. She noted that women in the 19th century had to contend with open hostility and abuse to win their right to vote, and that now in the 21st century, it cannot be acceptable for any person to have to face threats and intimidation simply because she or he has dared to express a political opinion. The previous year, Theresa May had commissioned the Committee on Standards in Public Life to conduct an investigation into the intimidation of MPs during the 2017 general election. And she observed that it was a cause of deep concern that, in this centenary year of votes for women, its finding was that political candidates who are female were being disproportionately targeted with intimidation and abuse. May concluded that something must be done to protect the proud democratic system that had evolved out of the struggles and victory of last century's suffragettes, and that something was going to be the implementation of a suite of recommendations made by the Committee on Standards in Public Life on how to better police the internet. Arguments for progressing with state regulation of social media and the internet more generally have frequently involved popular perceptions about the prevalence of misogyny, the frequency of online hate speech, and in particular the particular prevalence of online hate speech targeting women in public life. But just how prevalent is online hate speech really? How disproportionately does it really impact on women? And perhaps most importantly, can perceptions of prevalence and disproportional impact really justify the introduction of regulations that could have profound implications for democracy and the possibility of open adult discourse? The purpose of this video is to answer the first two of those questions by considering the current research and data that is freely available to anyone who'd care to look for it. And by doing so, encourage you to consider the most appropriate answer to my third question. And to do all of this most effectively, I want to begin by considering arguably the most comprehensive snapshots of online abuse trends in the UK, conducted by none other than OFCOM, the UK government's preferred choice of regulatory body that they hope one day soon will enforce the regulations currently being considered by Parliament in the Online Harms Bill. So for the uninitiated, in 2018, Ofcom commissioned the research company Kantar Media to examine the concerns and experiences of UK internet users in relation to online harms. This involved conducting detailed face-to-face interviews with weightings applied to get a representative sample in relation to region, gender, age, and working status. The main objective was to quantify concerns about and reported experience of online harm across four key categories: data privacy, hacking and security, content that people view, read or listen to online, and interactions with other users. The report's key findings were that 79% of UK internet users were concerned about aspects of going online. 45% had personally experienced some form of online harm. 21% had taken action to report it. And while there were mixed views on the current level of regulation, 52% of internet using adults believe more social media regulation is required. Now, on the one hand, I guess that it could be argued that such findings would seem to clearly support the argument for tighter regulation of the net. However, when we dig below those headline findings, we do find a much more diverse and complex picture. For example, while in total roughly 8 in 10 respondents expressed concern about using the internet, the areas of greatest concern related to the potential harm of children and fraud, financial loss or identity theft. Only 34% expressed a concern about interactions or contents without additional prompting, and only 1 in 10 respondents expressed concern about hate speech or offensive language. And while the survey indicates that close to half of UK adult internet users have experienced some form of online harm, again, less than 1 in 10 cited experience relating to offensive language or behaviour. In total, 6% cited experience of hate speech, which is the same proportion of people who cited harm caused by spending too much time online. OFCOM's report breaks down adult users' experiences by age, but surprisingly does not identify any trends in relation to their sex. I say surprisingly for two main reasons. Firstly, Theresa May and numerous other politicians from numerous other parties have specifically singled out gendered trends in relation to online harms as a priority issue of concern and a key reason why regulation is urgently required. Indeed, my perception would be that politicians have expressed more concern about high-profile claims of online harm experienced by adult women in public life than they have about the impact of online harms targeting children, especially if those children happen to be boys. But the other reason I found this oversight to be surprising is because OFCOM did, after all, go to the bother of collecting the relevant data. So I decided it would be a worthwhile exercise to take a deep dive into their 500 odd pages of tables and raw data to see what I might find. And sure enough, when we consider areas of online harm most especially relevant to the popular narrative that has been built around perceptions and claims that the rise of social media has led to an epidemic of online misogyny, we find that in each area, less than 1 in 10 users have reported any sort of experience, and significantly in every single area with the exception of targeted political messages. Adult women and adult men from throughout the UK report extremely similar levels of abuse. And while the less cynical amongst you may share my surprise that this statistically significant trend wasn't highlighted by OFCOM, those of you that have been following this subject with at least one half eye open may express somewhat less surprise, because while OFCOM's finding may represent the most robust evidence to date on this subject, certainly in the UK, it is certainly far from being the first to indicate that women are not uniquely or even especially being targeted for online abuse. For example, the loudly publicised concerns that such a trend could create a chill factor for our democratic process by scaring young women away from the cut and thrust of public life can seem potentially counterproductive in the context that by now numerous studies have found that men, and especially men whose politics is perceived to be to the right of centre, actually receive significantly higher levels of abuse. In 2019, the BBC carried out a survey of MPs concerning the threats and abuse that they had received when carrying out their public role. Key findings by the BBC included that male MPs attracted significantly more abuse than female ones, and that Conservative MPs attracted significantly more abuse than members of the left-leaning Labour Party. Sheffield University's Department of Computer Science have been tracking trends in relation to the frequency and direction of Twitter abuse targeting MPs for a number of years. They have reported an increased frequency of abusive tweets targeting MPs in the run-up to the 2015, 2017 and 2019 general elections respectively. Key findings that have been broadly consistent across all three studies include that, on average, male MPs attract significantly more abuse than female ones, Conservative MPs attract significantly more abuse than those standing for Labour, and the overwhelming majority of insulting tweets were targeted at a relatively small number of prominent politicians. Significantly, this was the same data pool that in 2017 Amnesty International used to claim that Labour's Diane Abbott received 50% of all abuse targeting female MPs. Sheffield's study confirmed the finding that Abbott did indeed experience a comparatively higher level of abuse when compared to most politicians of both sex. But by extending their scope of inquiry to include all politicians, they were able to present her experience in the wider context that over 50% of all abuse sent to all politicians was actually sent to 4 very high-profile men, and 1 female MP that Amnesty had somehow overlooked, then Prime Minister Theresa May. In 2018, the University of Hereford conducted a survey of UK MPs asking about their experiences and the impact of being trolled online. Once again, they found that male MPs received reliably more trolling compared to their female peers. And in 2015, Demos analysed approximately 2 million tweets over a 2-week period sent to a selection of prominent and widely followed public figures on Twitter. The study included celebrities, politicians, journalists and musicians, specifically chosen to ensure that an equal number, roughly 1 million, were aimed at each sex. Demos found that 2.5% of the tweets directed at male public figures contained abuse, compared to only 0.95% of the tweets received by prominent women. And to return to the subject of the wider general public and Ofcom's finding that 1 in 10 women and men in the UK have experienced some form of hate speech, 2 major US studies conducted by the Pew Research Center found that approximately 4 in 10 Americans have experienced at least one type of online harassment, with men found to be slightly more likely to have experienced harassment when compared to women. Now, obviously, additional nuance about specific types of abuse and its impact can also be found in most of these studies. For example, the Demos study found that journalism was the only public life category where women received more abuse than men. Both Pew studies found that women, especially young women, encountered sexualized forms of abuse at much higher rates than men. Hereford University found that women were much more likely to receive abusive words perceived as gendered, such as witch. And both studies found that women were significantly more likely to be upset by abuse received than their male peers. Furthermore, although the estimated scale, type and impact of abuse does vary from study to study, as does the definition of abuse, all do clearly identify evidence of online harms, and I personally would support the promotion of appropriate, proportional, effective and balanced actions aimed at protecting children and vulnerable adults. But with that said, given the direction of travel to date, and very real concerns that knee-jerk and extremely politicised reactions to this problem are already pushing us down a path involving secretive, stochastic and selective censorship, which in turn is corralling us all into cyber ghettos and political echo chambers, I for one think it's vital that any state intervention doesn't end up doing more harm than any actual good. Which is why I think that anyone concerned about the current chill factors impacting on open, honest and adult discourse should be urgently considering the following. If study after study show that men experience online abuse at similar or even greater levels than women, especially women in public life, then why do politicians keep telling us that the opposite is true? And how on earth did they convince a Scottish judge to call for sweeping legislative changes to very specifically address popular perceptions about the gendered nature of online abuse? And in the next video in this series, I'm going to reveal a surprisingly simple answer to the second part of my question by taking a closer look at a process led by that Scottish judge that essentially helped to reinforce and rubber stamp the misogyny myth.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.